The Photo Vault. A journey into vernacular photography, archives, and photo books. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Photo Vault. Today we are of sorts traveling to Beijing. At least this is where Thomas Sauvin, today's guest, found and is still finding his treasures in a dumpsite. What you hear in the background is a public choir in a park in Beijing. One of the many charming features you can find when you stroll through these kind of parks. I met Thomas the first time in Beijing, but that is half a lifetime ago, when probably we, but more so Beijing, was a very different place, sprawling with openness and foreigners like us working creatively with our Chinese colleagues. Thomas is a French editor and artist. His project, Beijing Silvermine, has gained substantial recognition, if not fame, through the books and exhibitions he put out in the last 10 years. In our conversation, you can follow his path and history, how he became a collector and started his rather massive archive project. Thomas, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We actually met the first time in Beijing. That was back in those heydays of China. Full creative energy. What did bring you actually originally to Beijing?
Oh, very long story short, I started studying Chinese when I was 13 years old.
Oh.
Then my school offered that I do a family exchange in 1998. That's the first time I went to Beijing. I was staying in a Chinese family. I enjoyed being there. I enjoyed being in a culture that I quite didn't know. I enjoyed being very far away from my family. And very soon after the baccalaureate, I just decided to go to China for my studies. So I went to university in Beijing. And as soon as I graduated from that university, I started working in photo festivals in China. I worked a bit in Pingyao, a bit in Lianzhou. I worked for the Guangdong Museum of Art Biennale of Photography. And 1 year in 2016, as I was working in Lianzhou, I met Timothy Pruss, the artistic director of the Archive of Modern Conflict, who asked me to start buying Chinese contemporary photography for the collection. So for about 8 years of time, I started collecting material for them. So basically my job was to travel around in China, meet Chinese photographers, try to understand their work, their influences, their followers, and so on, and suggest works that should enter the collection.
To add here, the Archive of Modern Conflict is a private archive based in the UK and Canada that has an incredible amount of materials collected, not only directly on conflict, as the name might suggest, but more on side stories of conflict. They started with private albums created in Germany during World War II and put out a great amount of publications that were inspirations to many who are in the world of the vernacular.
There was a lot of interesting Chinese work at that time. We were around 2008, the energy of the Olympic game, the country seemed to really open to the world, and there was a lot of interest about China. So all of this made it a good time to actually build such a collection. After a while, I realized that this job actually was slightly changing my relationship to photography, which is something I always loved. And it changed it in a way that every time I would go in a gallery or in a photo festival, I would see a work that I like. And it would kind of be a bad news for me because it means that I'd had to meet the photographer, understand their work, and then pitch it in London, and then supervise digitization, production, wrapping of the work, financial aspects of it. And I quite naturally felt the need to start digging things in flea markets and online in order to find material that's less linked to statement, images which are abandoned, and where nobody is here to actually explain to me why it exists and how I should see it, but actually enjoy the element of mystery that you have with found photography. Of course, this comes as no surprise when you work with the Archive of Modern Conflict. They're above all known for collecting found photography. So this is something that I learned from them. And then I started collecting things for myself. You know how it goes in this kind of work.
Absolutely.
First, you collect for someone, and then after a couple of years, you start saying, "Oh, this is a really nice one. This is for me. This is for them." And after it was a very happy collaboration, and I really enjoyed working for them and learned so much from them. But at some point, I felt the need to actually build my own collection and probably collect a bit less, but spend more time to actually share the fruit of my investigation. That was a source of frustration of what I was doing with them. So I started collecting a lot of prints, vintage prints online, mostly on Kungfuzi and Chiu Baba, the two main websites eBay-like website to collect such material in China. Collected a lot of photo albums, found quite a few of them in flea markets as well. And as you know, the game of a collector is always to try and find ways to collect different sources in order to collect new material. And I came to the conclusion that all the material I was collecting was actually analog silver prints, right? So they were made with negatives, and I could never find the negatives. So I thought maybe this is a good direction to dig, and I would be interested in collecting negatives. And long story short, after doing online researches, I actually found someone who is in the north of the city of Beijing, working in a recycling plant. And his job is to recycle trashes that contain silver nitrate. So he has a network of people working for him. He collects all sorts of nitrate-infused material, X-rays, negative films, and so on. Put everything into acid in order to collect that precious powder. And by doing that, he also destroys the material. When I saw that, I decided to stroke a deal with him in order to buy the negatives by the kilo. And after collecting artworks for so many years, there was something very nice about buying photos like you would buy potatoes, right? I brought the first bag back to the studio, started looking at it. At that time, I was very much influenced by Archive of Modern Conflict, of course, but also whatever Martin Parr was doing with found objects, the works of Eric Kessels. And I tried to find similar images, the so-called nuggets, these very special photos that you can find in like everyday photography. Important to mention that most of the material I collect from this source is 35 millimeter color negatives shot by everyday people in China somewhere between 1985 and 2005. 1985 being the time when the point and shoot cameras became accessible to everyday people in China. 2005 being the time when digital photography started taking over. As I was searching for these special nuggets, I ended up being quite disappointed because the photos were pretty boring. They were pretty banal. They were very obvious. Every time I would see one, I would basically understand why it was shot. A lot of photos of babies, a lot of photos of birthdays, people traveling, having a happy time. So, to be honest, for the first 2 years, I hesitated to continue because it was still some money to buy the negatives, but that was quite cheap. That was okay. But it was a bigger investment to actually have someone to digitize the material. And it took about 2 or 3 years for the project to start making sense. I would say it made sense for two reasons. First, it started making sense when there was enough quantity. And this is something quite interesting with found photography. One can claim that quantity is more important than quality, which is not a claim that you can have very often about anything. But the quantity makes something that's quite magical, is that you switch from material that's very intimate, very personal, but then when they meet and when they grow bigger, then slowly you can switch into collective memories.
If you look at Thomas or Beijing Silvermine books, you will understand that by looking at an enormous amount of images, you can identify themes that make you understand the importance of events. The publications Thomas put out are also very funny and give an easy access to his archive through humor.
So I thought it would be an interesting material to try and draw a portrait of a place and a time, because this source of material felt like it was the photo album of an entire city, in a way. Something else was quite interesting to me is that all the images I saw, I was carrying them with me every day. Every day I would look, I would select a few, I would print them, and I would put them in my bag. I always had this thing, a very materialist thing, where when I find something, I need it to exist in a physical way, and I need it to be with me in a way. And I would take like a cab, and the driver would say, what do you do for a living? I would briefly explain what I try to do, and eventually I would show him the photos, and he would tell me, oh, this is shit. You're interested in that? I have so many of these at home. It's shit. And I was interested by this reaction. In one way, it felt to everybody that it was the most common kind of images. And on the other hand, it's imagery from China that you couldn't see anywhere. It would actually be an interesting thing to probably export a different face of China that's not very often seen in the West. And I started making photo books and exhibitions in order to spread that vision. Probably interesting to try and discuss a bit the way the project was and is perceived in the West, and compare it to the way it's perceived in China, because it's two quite different stories. You spent a lot of time in China, you met a lot of foreigners there, you met a lot of journalists. You have a good understanding of how China is presented to the West in a always so political way, right? And people seem divided into two groups, the one who hates China and the one who loves China. The one who love China are obsessed with tea culture, calligraphy, Tai Chi Chuan in the park in the morning, mystical mountains, and so on. The one who hates China actually are obsessed with corruption, destruction, pollution, Ai Weiwei, Tibet. And the photos I had to share were really neutral in that way. They were in the middle of these extremes. And when I first showed the work in 2013 at the Format Festival in Derby in the UK, a couple of independent people came to me and said, it's very touching because these photos remind me of my childhood. And I feel like this photo could be from my own photo album.
These were people from the UK or from China?
Yes,
UK.
yeah, sorry.
Well, that's
people from the UK, people from France. And I found this quite interesting because it meant that something that's Chinese can actually have a universal value, which is quite rare. Whatever is Chinese is always very Chinese. We always say it's a different culture. We don't understand it. They don't like to lose face and so on. And now we discover that their everyday photo is just exactly as ours, and meaning that probably the few happy moments they want to record in their life are similar to ours. So this universal element to it was very interesting, and also already I had enough images to start like digging themes that were very China specific and that could show and tell a few stories about the history of the country during the late 80s and mostly the 90s. So that was an important trigger for me. And simultaneously, I would show the work in China. Obviously, the Chinese audience wouldn't react the same way. The first significant exhibition I did the same year, I believe it was in 2013 as well, in the festival of Lianzhou, where I was working a couple of years before that. And an interesting feedback that I had was that people were quite amazed that history could be written with fragments of images from everyday people in a country where history is usually written by the Department of Communication or Department of Propaganda, as we like to call him. Quite a few publications in China, interest from newspaper, magazines, who actually were paying copyrights to use the images. So never too conflictual on that front. And it's been now 14 years that I keep on building this collection. Sometimes people understand and think that I actually collected the entire archive at once in 2009, and I keep exploiting it since then. It's actually not the way it happened. This Xiaoma, the man who works in this recycling plant, since 2009, contact me more or less regularly and actually provide bags of 20 to 100 kilos of negatives every now and then.
So they still arrive at your doorstep?
They still arrive at my doorstep, and I keep on adding them up, and I will keep on collecting from him as long as he proposes things to me. And one day it will stop, and the day it will stop, I would probably be able to claim that this project witnessed the death of analog photography in China, which is something that I believe is quite valuable and quite interesting in the history of the medium.
I remember I worked on some Polaroid projects back in China in like 2010. I would take pictures with expired Polaroid material. I present them there. The perception was definitely very, very different because people didn't have necessarily the emotional connection to, let's say, Polaroid material. Because I show an old Polaroid material in Europe or the US, right away everybody has this nostalgia.
Of course.
But I think that nostalgia is very different in China. Like it doesn't exist in the same kind of way.
It's when it comes to the specific object of Polaroid, it's a non-existent nostalgia, simply because it's an object and a medium that never reached the Chinese market, or it really reached it in a completely insignificant way. In the same way, we have this strong nostalgia and connection with Super 8, and it's the same. Super 8 never reached the Chinese market. When it comes to point and shoot, when it comes to 35 millimeter color negatives, and more importantly, the 10 by 15 rounded corner glossy print that were made out of these negatives, this nostalgia does exist, but I'm not sure I would even call it a nostalgia. Maybe between the time the project started and now, things are shifting a little bit. But it's not even a nostalgia because it's so so close to people.
Yeah.
People shot it. People have it. People have those prints, and China always claim rightfully to have a 5,000 years history, and something that happened in the late 90s is not considered as history yet. It's too much of a recent past. I think that instead of trying to collect material from the late 19th century, which is hard to find and very expensive, it's probably wiser to massively collect things from a very recent past and quietly wait for 50, 100 years for it to really make sense.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, in terms of the people who are engaged with vernacular everyday photography like you, I think you're probably the one who collects the youngest material in a way.
Sure.
I mean, I'm more, I would say I'm focused sort of on the 50s, 60s, 70s, where in a lot of countries, photography became big for the first time, which I think is also very exciting. But you're right, the value people give to this really depends. Like, I mean, I work with institutions, they still wouldn't see what I do as valuable because it's too recent. And,
True.
and they don't get that actually in many countries this is what you have. In China, you're not finding anything from like 1930 because it's all gone.
Of course.
So what you have definitely has that depository of a whole generation.
And as long as the project is ambitious enough and things are made so that it's slightly sustainable, then in 50 years of time, it will become historical material. Yeah, you're completely right. Something that defined my collection, or my archive, actually, I would rather call it that way, is first that it's mostly material from a very recent past, and second that it's almost 100% abandoned material, neglected material, and for 95% of it, I can rightfully claim that if I didn't collect it, the material wouldn't exist anymore, and that's absolutely crucial to my approach. Absolutely crucial because this relationship that I have with the material, this paternity that I have because I somehow saved these images, give me a lot of freedom to actually use them the way I want. When you compare the exact same material, but you make it go through different paths, then the relationship you have with it and the rights and the freedom that you have to actually deal with it change drastically. For example, I collect these negatives for 14 years and I have done over 15 books and numerous exhibitions out of this material. One day, a Chinese friend comes to me with a very big box, and inside is the entire photographic archive of her father. Everything is in perfect condition, labeled in very nice little booklets and so on. And she told me, I give this box to you. I believe you do a better job than me with this. It's yours. I was very touched. I kept the box. I basically couldn't even open it. I didn't feel like I was in a position or I had the right to interfere with the material. If this same material had come in a mess, in a bag, collected from a recycling plant, I would have acted completely differently. The fact that the material is completely anonymous and completely decontextualized in a way is very important to me because it gives enough freedom to do whatever I want. And I'm not a journalist. I'm not an investigator. The way I deal with the material is the approach is more the approach of an artist. So instead of trying to do investigations and find who the people were and try to build stories that way. I rather emphasize the element of mystery that can exist around this type of material.
I guess all of us who work with, including me, who work with these images that we didn't produce by clicking a button. I get asked the same question as I will ask you now. What's the ethos around also selling these things? I mean, I make books, you make books. We produce materials that in the end someone puts down €1 to purchase it, which means that the faces we reprint, they get somewhere monetized. So I'm curious to hear what's your. I mean, I have my own ethical thing to make it valid that it's okay for me. How do you make it okay for you?
There's of course a lot of ethical aspect to such a practice that should be considered very carefully. When you deal with found material, first you deal with a form of invasion of privacy. You are facing photos that weren't meant to be in your hands, and that shows people that sometimes are in a very vulnerable position. So you always need to keep in mind that you should be careful with the way you use the images. This being said, the material I find, with 35mm negatives, it's always something that was given to a stranger in order to develop the film. So there's a very strong censorship made in the first place. And I accidentally happened to bump into some images I consider that shouldn't be before my eyes, involving nudity and so on, even though it's very, very rare. And it goes without saying that I wouldn't use this. That's the first thing. Second thing, authorship. If you're in a position to actually know who's the author of the images, then I think one should do everything that's in his power to actually contact this person and have a form of agreement from him. But when it comes to found photography, it's absolutely almost never possible. When it comes to actually the diffusion of the images, it's a choice that needs to be made. And it's a choice I made in 2009 when I started this project. First position could be that because the invasion of privacy, because of the impossibility of actually getting in touch with the author of the images, you just shouldn't do it. I just leave it at the recycling plant, it destroys the material, and my life goes on. I decided not to do that. I decided to salvage this material and to share it as much as I can, because I think it's a beautiful source of photography, and it's worth being preserved. Now that this decision is made, you, of course, in the lifetime of such a project, of such an archive, come to times where you produce books. And it's not a must, but I'm obsessed with books, so I make a lot of books, and these books sometimes sell, and when they sell, you sometimes make money out of it. You're also offered to produce prints and to possibly sell these prints for a more important amount of money. And this is something I do without any problem. It's a bit sometimes a bit hard to understand for people, but I am very clear in my mind that I'm not the author of the photos, but I'm also very clear in the idea that I am the author of the project that brings them to light. And we're talking about adoption, we're talking about paternity, and all these things gives me the right to exploit and deal with the material the way I want. And by the end of the day, the project is quite a financial disaster. So people are always very happy to know that I'm not making so much money out of it. I don't know why people are so vicious, you know.
Well, I guess, people, when it comes to appropriation, I mean, we're dealing with the same issues, you and I. When it comes to appropriation, people definitely, I think, money is always the biggest point. If you appropriate something and you get money, something's wrong in people's head, I guess. For sure. But it's interesting. I like the way you define it, that you say you're the artist, the editor of your project. You're not the artist of the actual photograph, obviously.
Yeah.
So, which I do think there's a lot of now within this world of vernacular, there's a lot of people who appropriate images and they make these images their artwork, which is quite a distinction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something that's interesting to notice as well, is that for a period of time, many artists actually dealt with found photography in order to produce artworks, and to do so, they would have a physical intervention on the image, stitching, hand coloring, collage, and so on. And we have this form of understanding that as soon as you interfere with an existing image, then it becomes something new, and then it can be an artwork, and then you have the right to sell it. In my case, I almost, when it comes to print, I almost never had a significant intervention on the image. It's actually the original negative enlarged on the photo paper and preserved that way. And it's not always very easy to understand that actually the act of recontextualization of an image is an artistic act. This is not something I invented. Luckily, it exists for a couple of decades now, and Sultan and Mendel, Fletcher and Robin, Boltanski, and many more artists, Joachim Schmidt, of course, showed the way on that front. But I don't think that the act of collecting and actually sharing these images in the form of photo book and exhibition is a simple act of appropriation. I think it's way more than that, and it's artistic practice on its own.
Yeah, absolutely agree. As you said, by now, of course, we're in your studio here. It's filled with your materials. We can see some of these bags, I guess, where the negatives come in. I mean, these enormous bags that are used for construction materials, I think, no, and all sorts of stuff. What will happen to this in the end? What do you think? What's the, once you get no more negatives? I mean, it's enormous responsibility that's in the end on your shoulders too. I mean, I personally also know this kind of heaviness where you think, man, at one point, what am I gonna do with all this stuff?
Honestly, it's hard to tell. If you had asked me this question, let's say 5 years ago, I would have told you that I want the entire collection to end up in the Chinese institution. I believe that would make sense. If you ask me the same question today, like you do, I am less certain that I will find such a place in China, or at least as long as the political context is what it is. Another option would be that one day it's sold or donated to a French museum. That would make sense. Another option would be that actually I build a foundation and that the entire collection stays in the studio, but the studio becomes a half public, half private place that people can come visit and actually find images from. I certainly won't give it to my son, because this is probably the worst thing a father could do. So I will spare this option with him. What's quite interesting and quite important, the studio here in Paris is big, is very nice. Everything is here and nicely organized. But so much can happen to the collection. A fire, more likely a flood. We're right next to the Seine River, and it's a highly floodable area. Every century, There's a massive flood in Paris. It was supposed to happen 10 years ago, so it's even more likely to happen by now. And if it does, the entire studio is underwater. We're not speaking 20 centimeters of water on the floor. It's like the entire studio will be submerged, and this is for sure. So what's going to happen to this archive? Hopefully beautiful things, but it's hard for me to tell. It took me a couple of years to actually understand that this is why I'm making photo books. That's the main reason. I make photo books to archive this material. I don't know what's going to happen to the physical collection, but I know what's going to happen with the books. They're cheap, they sell, they duplicate, they travel, they stayed in random shelves in libraries, university, museums, private collectors, everyday people's home, more or less all over the world. And I think that's a very nice way to actually archive material. Of course, part of my practice is one of a collector, but sometimes I feel like I'm not a real collector, in a sense that I would, for example, be very interested in a certain type of photos, you know, the head-to-toe portraits that you can find everywhere in China. I made a book about this in 2013. In order to make that book, I needed to collect a lot of these. The more I would collect, the more I would find special ones. The people would sell them to me, would make them more and more expensive, and I feel like I absolutely needed them, and I bought them, and I put all of them in a very nice folder. And eventually one day, I digitized everything and made a book about this collection together with a Chinese designer, Mei Shuzhi. And the book was out in an edition of 1000. And I noticed that as soon as the book was out, I was not very attached to the original material anymore. If I was asked to sell it, I would do it without a blink. If it was to be destroyed in a flood, I wouldn't say I would be happy, but I would say it's preserved in a very nice way in the form of photo books. And I think it's a very, very, very good reason to make a photo book. And also it puts enough pressure so that you make it as perfectly as you can, because it's possibly the last shape in which the material will actually exist.
Yeah, well, I mean, the photo book definitely is much more democratic than any archive, because who has access to archives? I mean,
sure,
it's very difficult.
Sure, it's democratic, and it's a multiple.
Yeah,
it's a duplication of something. Whenever you want to make sure that you don't lose something, it's true for keys. It's true for photos as well. If you multiply them, you're always likely to have one left.
So the future of archives is the multiplication.
I would like to think so, yes.
I think that's a very good end for this conversation. Super. Thanks a lot, Thomas.
Thank you.
That was Thomas Sauvin talking to me in Paris. Although he and I have known each other for a while, I was very moved by his deep analysis of his work, the impact it has, and how an archive such as his should or could be handled. I certainly agree with him that the book is in many ways a very good and solid form to deal with archive materials or collections. I believe the more publications from different people and different angles are being produced about the same material creates a wider understanding of an archive. In the text section of the podcast, you will find links to Thomas and also the work of Beijing Silvermine. He recently started to branch out of his Chinese culture sphere, one could say, and released a book co-authored with Max Pinkers called The Future Without You. It comprises of US stock photographs produced in the 1990s that somehow ended up in China, and that's where Thomas found them. It is a rather surreal book of capitalist imagery. There's something uneven and disturbing about it. Worth checking out. Thank you for listening to the Photo Vault. Subscribe to our channel, on your podcast platform. This way we can make sure to keep feeding you with good interviews on archives, collections and photo books. Lukas Birk says, 再见.